Have you ever felt the cold, oily press of a silver spoon in your mouth and realized it was actually a gag? That was my life. My name was Rune Draken, and for 26 years I lived in a world where the air smelled like expensive bourbon and raw crude oil. My family, the Drakens, didn't just own land in West Texas. We owned the horizon. My father, Magnar, was a man carved out of flint, hard gray, and capable of sparking a fire that could consume anyone who stood too close. I grew up believing I was the prince of this black gold empire, the refined, intellectual counterweight to my older brother Corson, who was the brute force, the jagged edge of our father's will. I remember the night everything shattered like it was etched into my retinas with acid. It was one of those Texas nights where the sky is so big it feels like it's trying to crush you heavy with the scent of an oncoming electrical storm. Corson had called me out to Pump Station 9, a rusted, groaning relic of our grandfather's era located 3 hours from the nearest paved road. He said he'd found a leak in the books, something that could ruin the family if the feds caught wind of it. He sounded panicked, out of breath, vulnerable. I, the ever-loyal brother, the one who handled the ledgers while he handled the labor, didn't hesitate. I drove my custom SUV through the dirt and grit thinking I was going to save him. I was going to save the Draken name. When I arrived, the station was a silhouette of skeletal iron against a bruised purple sky. The rhythm of the pump jacks was a slow mechanical heartbeat. Thump hiss, thump hiss. Corson was standing by the open hatch of a massive underground storage tank, his silhouette illuminated by the flickering yellow light of a portable generator. He wasn't wearing his usual designer work gear. He was in heavy overalls, grease-stained and looking like a man ready to dispose of a problem. "Rune, you're late," he said, his voice flat. There was no panic, no vulnerability, just the terrifying stillness of a predator that has already cornered its prey. I stepped out of the car, the dry wind whipping my hair across my face. The GPS lost signal miles back. "Show me the records, Corson. If there's an audit, we need to move the offshore assets tonight." He laughed. It wasn't a brotherly laugh. It was a dry, rasping sound that set my teeth on edge. "Always the books with you. Always the numbers. You really think Dad cares about the money? He cares about the legacy. And he's decided that a legacy can't have two heads. It's messy. It's weak." Before I could process the words, Corson moved with a speed I didn't know his massive frame possessed. He didn't pull a gun. That would be too clean for a Draken. He lunged, his hand rough as sandpaper, grabbing my throat and slamming me against the cold metal of the storage tank. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs, leaving me gasping, staring into eyes that held absolutely zero recognition of our shared childhood. There were no memories of us playing in the oil fields there. No shared secrets, just the cold calculation of a man taking out a competitor. "You were always the favorite, weren't you?" Corson hissed, his face inches from mine. "The smart one. The one who went to Yale while I stayed here and bled for every barrel. Dad looked at you and saw the future. He looked at me and saw a tool. Well, tools break things, Rune. That's what they're for." He dragged me toward the open hatch. The smell of crude oil was overwhelming now, thick, cloying, and smelling of ancient death. I thrashed, kicking my legs, clawing at his arms, but I was a creature of boardrooms and gala dinners. He was a creature of the earth. He pinned my arms behind my back with a sickening pop of my shoulder. The pain was an explosion of white light, but it was drowned out by the sheer terror of what was coming. "Don't worry," he whispered into my ear, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "The police will find your car crashed in the ravine tomorrow. A tragic accident. The brilliant Rune Draken, drunk on his own success, drove off into the dark. I'll even cry at the funeral. I've been practicing." With a brutal heave, he lifted me off my feet. For a split second, I was airborne, the stars swirling above me. Then, the world turned black and viscous. I hit the surface of the oil pool inside the tank with a thud that felt like hitting concrete. It wasn't like water, it was heavy. It was a suffocating, lukewarm embrace that immediately filled my ears and nose. I tried to scream, but the thick, bitter sludge rushed into my mouth, coating my throat in a layer of chemical filth. I clawed at the walls of the tank, but they were slick with grease, offering no grip. Above me, the square of light from the hatch seemed miles away. I saw Corson's silhouette look down one last time before the heavy iron lid swung shut. The clack of the bolt sliding into place was the final sound of my old life. Darkness. Absolute crushing darkness. I don't know how long I struggled. The oil was thick, making every movement feel like I was fighting through wet cement. My lungs were screaming, a burning sensation spreading through my chest as I fought the urge to inhale the toxic fumes. I was drowning in the very thing that had made my family rich. The Draken wealth was literally swallowing me whole. My mind began to fracture. I thought of the gale as the fine wine, the way my father had patted my shoulder just that morning, knowing his eldest son was going to murder me by midnight. The betrayal was a sharper cold than the oil. Then the hallucinations started. I saw the faces of the people I had stepped on to climb the corporate ladder. I saw the empty eyes of the workers whose pensions we'd slashed. And then I saw nothing. My heart gave one final erratic flutter against my ribs, and the pressure in my head became unbearable. I let go. I stopped fighting the weight. I sank into the black, feeling my soul detach from the heavy, oil-soaked shell of Rune Draken. Death wasn't a light at the end of a tunnel. It was a violent, jarring transition. I woke up screaming, but no sound came out, only a ragged, wet wheeze. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I thought I was still in the tank. It was dark, and the smell was even worse, a nauseating cocktail of rotting garbage, human waste, and stale vomit. But the texture was different. I wasn't floating. I was lying on something hard and damp. I tried to move my hand, and a jolt of lightning bolt pain shot up my arm. Not from a dislocated shoulder, but from a deep systemic ache that felt like my very marrow was on fire. I looked down at my hands. They weren't my hands. They were skeletal, the skin a translucent gray, covered in a map of track marks and weeping sores. The fingernails were jagged and caked with filth. I was in a rusted-out freight car on the edge of a crumbling industrial wasteland. Through the open door, I could see the jagged skyline of a city that wasn't Houston. It was colder here. The air was thin and bit at my skin. I tried to sit up and my head spun so violently, I threw up a yellow acidic bile onto the floorboards. This wasn't my body. I was trapped in a frame that was failing, a heart that was stuttering, and a mind that was screaming for a fix I didn't even understand. This was the body of a ghost, a man the world had chosen to forget. I reached up to touch my face, feeling the hollowed-out cheeks and the matted, greasy hair. My fingers brushed against the collar of a filthy, oversized flannel shirt. I wasn't Rune Draken anymore. I was a name on a toe tag that hadn't been written yet. I was Fenvig, a junkie, dying in a forgotten corner of Detroit. The withdrawal hit me, then a wave of cold sweat and violent tremors that made my bones feel like they were being crushed in a vice. I rolled onto my side, clutching my stomach, sobbing without tears. Why was I here? Why didn't I just stay in the oil? As I curled into a ball on the splintered wood, my hand brushed against something hard, tucked into the lining of the freight car's wall, right next to where my head had been resting. It was a small, tattered, waterproof bag, the kind used by hikers to keep electronics dry. With trembling, clumsy fingers, I pulled it toward me. My vision was blurred, but as I unzipped the bag, I saw a flash of white. Inside was a small leather-bound ledger no larger than a deck of cards and a crumpled, yellowed scrap of paper. I pulled the paper out, my heart hammering against my fragile ribs. On it, written in a precise, elegant hand that I recognized instantly because it was mine, was a string of alphanumeric code ST-99-alpha-D-667. It was the master key. The backdoor access code to a shadow account I had built in my second year of college, a digital burn vault hidden behind layers of offshore shells that even my father didn't know existed. It was a failsafe I'd created as a paranoid joke, a way to disappear if the Draken Empire ever fell to the feds. I stared at the paper, the tremors in my hands subsiding for a fleeting second as a cold, predatory clarity washed over me. The pain was still there, the filth was still there, but the junkie in the corner was no longer just a victim. I clutched the ledger to my chest, the sharp edge of the leather digging into my collarbone, and felt a surge of something more powerful than the drug my body was screaming for. I sat up slowly, leaning my back against the vibrating metal wall of the train car as it began to lurch forward, the rusted wheels screaming against the tracks. I ignored the bile rising in my throat and the frantic pounding of my heart. I gripped the code so hard the paper began to tear my eyes, fixed on the gray, smog-choked horizon of the city as the morning light began to bleed through the clouds. My breath hitched in my chest, a ragged, desperate sound as I realized I was no longer just waiting for the end to come in the dark. The rusted iron floor of the freight car vibrated against my spine, a rhythmic grinding that felt like it was trying to shake my very soul loose from this skeletal frame. I didn't just feel the cold, I inhaled it. Every breath was a jagged shard of glass cutting through lungs that tasted of cheap tobacco and chemical decay. My fingers, stained with the grime of 1,000 forgotten nights, clutched that scrap of paper as if it were the only solid object in a dissolving universe. The alphanumeric string ST-99-Alpha-D-667 wasn't just a code anymore. It was a lifeline draped over the edge of a bottomless pit. I forced myself to breathe a shallow rattling sound that echoed in the cavernous metal box. My mind, the sharp analytical engine of Rune Draken, was fighting a losing war against the agonizing withdrawal symptoms of Fen Vig. My skin felt like a carpet of fire ants was marching across it, and my stomach twisted into knots so tight I thought my intestines would snap. I needed a fix. Every cell in this borrowed body was screaming for the very poison that had put Fen in this grave on wheels. But the ghost of Rune, the man who had outmaneuvered oil titans and silenced senators, snarled back from the depths of my consciousness. "Not today," I whispered, though the words were nothing more than a dry wheeze. "You died in the oil rune. But Fen is going to be the hand that reaches out of the grave." The train slowed as it groaned into the skeletal remains of a Detroit shipyard. I waited until the momentum died down before rolling toward the open door. Gravity was my enemy. I tumbled out, hitting the gravel with a force that sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I lay there for a long time, the smell of lake water and industrial rot filling my senses, watching the sun struggle to pierce through a thick shroud of smog. I looked like a discarded pile of rags, just another casualty of the Rust Belt. But inside that wreckage, a billionaire was calculating his first move. I needed 3 things to survive the next 48 hours: a way to clean the toxins out of my blood, a secure terminal, and a disguise that didn't scream predatory ghost. I dragged myself toward a cluster of shipping containers where I saw the flicker of a trash fire. A group of men sat huddled around it, their faces maps of despair. I didn't ask for permission. I slumped against a rusted bollard, nearby, my eyes darting, searching for a tool. I saw it, a discarded, cracked smartphone lying near a pile of scrap. It was ancient, the screen, a spiderweb of fractures, but the charging port looked intact. "That's junk, man," one of the men croaked, his voice sounding like gravel being turned in a mixer. "Battery's dead, screen's gone." I didn't answer. I reached into the hidden pocket of Fen's tattered coat and pulled out a small, heavy brass lighter I'd found in the waterproof bag. It was an antique, something the original Fen must have stolen and forgotten. I tossed it toward the man. His eyes widened as he caught the glint of real metal. "Keep it," I said, the voice sounding foreign to my own ears, raspy, low, and dangerous. "Just give me the phone and 10 minutes at that power strip by the guard shack." He nodded slowly, stunned by the transaction. I took the shattered device and crawled toward the shack. My hands shook so violently I had to pin my wrists against my knees just to steady them. When the screen flickered to life, showing a mere 3% battery, I felt a surge of adrenaline that bypassed the withdrawal. I accessed a public Wi-Fi signal, a weak, unsecured ghost of a connection, and opened an encrypted browser window that existed only in the deep layers of the dark web. I typed the code. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Please still be there. Please don't let them have found it. The screen looped for an agonizing 10 seconds. Then a single prompt appeared: ID required. I didn't have my retinal scan. I didn't have my fingerprints. But I had the one thing my father Magnar had unintentionally given me: a memory for the minutiae of our family's darkest sins. I typed in the coordinates of the first well my grandfather had ever capped, a dry hole that had been used to bury a rival's equipment in 1954. Access granted. Balance: $84,200 and $91.42. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my chest, turning into a racking cough that brought up more bile. 84 million. To the Drakens, it was a rounding error, a secret slush fund I'd skimmed over 5 years. To Fen Vig, it was the power of a god. But I couldn't touch it yet. Not directly. If I moved a single cent through a standard bank, Corson's digital watchdogs would trip a silent alarm. I had to be a ghost. I spent the next hour ignoring the cold sweat dripping down my neck, shuffling the funds through a labyrinth of cryptocurrency mixers and dead drop accounts in Estonia and the Cayman Islands. By the time the phone died for good, I had secured $10,000 in clean digital cash, accessible via a prepaid debit card I could pick up at any convenience store. The next 2 weeks were a blur of exquisite agony. I checked into a no-questions-asked motel on the outskirts of the city, a place where the walls were stained with the stories of 1,000 failures. I bought a heavy-duty chain and a padlock from a hardware store. I walked into that room, threw the key out the window into the overgrown weeds, and chained myself to the radiator. I had to kill Fenn's addiction before it killed Rune's mind. The fever dreams were the worst. I saw Corson's face in the peeling wallpaper, laughing as he poured crude oil down my throat. I saw my father Magnar standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes cold and judgmental, telling me that I was finally where I belonged, in the dirt. I screamed until my throat was raw, my body thrashing against the metal pipes, the skin on my wrists tearing until the radiator was slick with blood. I vomited until there was nothing left but dry heaves, my muscles cramping so hard I thought my bones would shatter. But every time I felt like letting go, I looked at that scrap of paper taped to the underside of the bedside table. ST-99 Alpha. It was my North Star. On the 15th day, the tremors stopped. I woke up on the linoleum floor, soaked in a puddle of my own sweat, but the fog had lifted. My eyes, once clouded and glassy, were now sharp, burning with a cold, predatory light. I looked in the cracked mirror above the sink. The man staring back was still Fenn Vig, gaunt, scarred, and haunted, but the posture had changed. The shoulders were square. The gaze was level. I used the last of my physical cash to buy a cheap suit from a thrift store and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. I shaved the scraggly beard, leaving a sharp, angular jawline that looked nothing like the soft, pampered face of Rune Draken. I looked like a disgraced academic, a man who had seen the bottom of a bottle and was trying to climb back up. I looked invisible. I took a bus to a high-end co-working space in downtown Detroit, a glass and steel monolith, where no one looked twice at a man with a laptop and a determined expression. I rented a private office for a month, paying in untraceable crypto. I sat down at the high-speed terminal and began to build my weapon. I didn't go after the Draken oil wells. Not yet. That was too big, too guarded. I went after the veins that fed the beast. I spent hours digging through the public filings of Draken Global Energy. Corson was aggressive, I realized. He was arrogant. He had already begun a massive expansion into the Permian Basin, over-leveraging the family's assets to buy up new drilling rights. He was gambling on high oil prices and low overhead. "You're a fool, Corson," I murmured to the glowing screen. "You forgot that an army can't fight if it can't eat." I started a new entity, V-Void Capital. To the world, it was a boutique hedge fund backed by private European interests. In reality, it was just me sitting in a small room with a cold cup of coffee and a burning thirst for ruin. I began to look at the logistics companies. The Draken Empire relied on a specific fleet of mid-sized tankers and a network of specialized trucking firms to move their crude from the remote stations to the refineries. These companies were small, independent, and currently struggling with high fuel costs and labor disputes. They were the weak links. One by one, I began to buy them. I didn't use the V-Void name directly. I used a dozen different shell companies, each acquiring a minority stake, slowly creeping toward a majority before anyone noticed. I was a spider weaving a web of fine, invisible silk around my brother's throat. I remember the moment I secured the controlling interest in Blue Ridge Hauling, the primary transport contractor for Pump Station 9, the place where Corson had tried to bury me. I sat back in my chair, the dim light of the office reflecting in my glasses. A strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't joy. It was a cold, clinical satisfaction. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Draken Global Corporate Headquarters. I didn't ask for Corson. I asked for the head of logistics. "This is the representative for the new majority ownership of Blue Ridge," I said, my voice steady, stripped of its old aristocratic lilt. "We've reviewed our current contracts with Draken Global. We find the terms unsatisfactory. Effective immediately, all transport out of the Permian sector is suspended pending a full renegotiation of rates." The man on the other end sputtered, threatening legal action, screaming about liquidated damages. I listened to his panic with a slight smile. It was the first time I'd felt truly alive since the oil filled my lungs. Tell Mr. Draken that if he wants his oil to move, he'll have to deal with me personally. I said, then hung up. I walked out of the office and headed toward a high-end barbershop. I needed to finish the transformation. I sat in the leather chair watching the stylist trim away the last remnants of Fenn's desperate life. I looked at the man in the mirror, the sharp suit, the cold eyes, the calculated stillness. I was no longer a victim. I was the ghost in the machine, the glitch that was going to bring the Draken Empire to its knees. As I stepped back out onto the street, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain and distant exhaust. I checked my burner phone. A notification flashed, a direct message from the Draken Global Executive Office requesting an urgent meeting at a private club in Chicago. I tucked the phone into my pocket, the metal feeling heavy and significant against my thigh. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I felt a singular chilling focus as I hailed a taxi, my gaze fixed on the reflection of the city lights in the rain-slicked pavement. The hunt hadn't just begun. I was already standing right behind him, and he hadn't even felt the chill yet. The black car glided through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago like a shark, cutting through deep, dark water. I watched the city lights smear against the window, a neon kaleidoscope that felt millions of miles away from the rusted freight car in Detroit. My reflection in the glass was a stranger's sharper, harder, stripped of the soft complacency of Rune Draken. I was Mr. Vig, now the man who held the leash on my brother's logistics, and I was heading into the lion's den with a smile tucked behind my teeth. The private club was an exercise in old money, arrogance, heavy oak doors, the smell of expensive tobacco, and a silence so thick it felt like it was hiding secrets. I stepped into the lounge, my polished shoes making no sound on the Persian rugs. I saw him immediately. Corson was sitting in a leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking every bit the conqueror he thought he was. He looked older, more stressed, the frantic expansion of the Draken Empire carving deep lines around his mouth. He didn't look up when I approached. He just stared at the ice in his glass. "You're the one holding my trucks hostage," he said, his voice a low growl that used to make me flinch. Now it just sounded like desperate noise. I sat down opposite him, crossing my legs with a deliberate, slow grace. I didn't offer a handshake. "I prefer to think of it as a necessary adjustment of resources, Mr. Draken. Your current contracts are a relic of a time when your family took loyalty for granted. Times change." Corson finally looked up. His eyes, those same eyes that had watched me drown in crude oil, scanned my face. I felt a momentary surge of adrenaline, a primitive fear that he might recognize the ghost in the shell, but his gaze skipped right over the truth. To him, I was just a vulture, a bottom feeder who had gotten lucky. He saw a man he could eventually crush, not a man he had already killed. "You're playing a dangerous game, Vig," he hissed, leaning forward. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? My father built this industry. We don't negotiate with parasites." "And yet here you are," I replied, my voice as cold as the wind off Lake Michigan. "Negotiating. Because without Blue Ridge, your Permian wells are just holes in the ground filling up with expensive, useless sludge. You're over-leveraged, Corson. You need that oil to move this week or your creditors are going to start asking questions your father can't answer." I saw a flicker of genuine panic in his eyes, gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a mask of rage. He didn't know how I knew about the debt. He didn't know I was the one who had quietly whispered to his banks, nudging them to tighten the screws. I was the architect of his anxiety, and I enjoyed every second of it. For the next hour, we danced. He threatened. I smiled. He offered crumbs. I demanded the whole loaf. I forced him to sign over a 15% equity stake in the Draken pipeline network just to get his trucks moving again. It was a surgical strike. I was carving out the heart of his empire, while he thought he was just paying a premium for a service. When he finally signed the digital contract, his hand shook slightly. "I'll remember this," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed violence. "I'm counting on it," I whispered. As I left the club, the cool night air felt like a victory. But the professional triumph was quickly overshadowed by a gnawing emptiness. I was winning the war, but the Fen Vig part of me, the physical shell I occupied, was beginning to feel the strain of the double life. The scars on my wrists from the radiator were a constant itch, a reminder that I was an intruder in a body that wasn't mine. I needed more than just financial ruin. I needed the truth. I spent the next month operating from the shadows of a luxury apartment I'd rented under another alias. I didn't return to Detroit. I followed the paper trail of the Draken family's past, digging into records that had been sealed before I was even born. I wasn't looking for oil. I was looking for blood. I found her in a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of Galveston, Alara Voss. She was a ghost of a woman, her skin like crumpled parchment, her eyes cloudy with cataracts. She had been the private nurse for the Draken estate 30 years ago. When I showed up at her door, I didn't pretend to be Rune. I didn't pretend to be Fen. I was just a man with a heavy gold watch and a question that could burn a house down. "You're too young to remember the screaming," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering on a sidewalk. She took the thick envelope of cash I offered without looking at it. "Abner, your father, or the man you called father. He was a man of shadows. He knew the price of a kingdom." She told me about the night of the twin births. It wasn't twins. It was two different women in two different rooms at the same hospital that Abner Thorne, my supposed father, had bought out for the night. One woman was a Thorne, a woman of royal lineage and fragile health. The other was a nameless drifter, a woman from the very slums I had just escaped who had come in off the street in labor. The Thorne child was weak, Alara said, her hand trembling as she sipped tea that had gone cold hours ago. He was the real heir, the one with the golden blood. But Abner knew the Thorne name carried a target. There were people, rivals, monsters who wanted that bloodline ended. So he made a trade. He took the healthy screaming brat from the slum mother and put him in the silk cradle. He took the real Thorne heir and gave him to the woman who would later be paid to disappear into the gutters. My heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Wait," I stammered, the coldness in my chest turning into a searing heat. "You're saying Rune was the slum child, the fake heir?" Alara nodded slowly. "You were the shield boy. You were the one he raised to be the target. He loved the real heir Corson too much to let him be the one at the top of the tower when the assassins came. He let Corson grow up in the shadows, rough and wild, while he dressed you in suits and taught you to speak like a king. You were the bait. You were always meant to be the one who died so the real bloodline could survive." The irony hit me like a physical blow. Corson hadn't just killed a brother, he had killed his own shield. And Abner, my father, had watched it happen, probably satisfied that the experiment had reached its natural conclusion. I wasn't a fallen prince. I was a commoner who had been fed the finest food just so I'd be fat enough for the slaughter. I left Alara's house in a daze. I drove for hours, the Texas landscape blurring into a brown and gray smear. I ended up back at the Houston docks, standing at the edge of the water where the oil tankers loomed like prehistoric beasts. The rage I felt wasn't the hot, impulsive anger of Rune Draken. It was a deep, tectonic shift. I had spent my life trying to be worthy of a name that wasn't mine. I had suffered the betrayal of a brother who was actually the master and a father who was actually a puppeteer. I pulled my phone out and looked at the stock ticker for Draken Global. It was plummeting. My logistics stranglehold was working. The company was hemorrhaging cash, and rumors of an internal coup were beginning to leak. Corson was drowning, and Abner was likely in his study pouring a drink and waiting for the dust to settle so he could crown his real son. "Not yet," I whispered to the dark water. "The shield is gone, Abner, and now the monster is coming for the throne." I didn't go back to the hotel. I went to a high-end tailor in downtown Houston, a man who had dressed me when I was Rune. He didn't recognize the gaunt, intense man in the glasses, but he recognized the way I carried myself. I ordered the most expensive black suit in the shop. I wanted to look like a funeral. The final move was ready. I had managed to acquire a debt-holding position in the Thorne family's private estate, the royal side of the business that Abner kept separate from the oil. I had the keys to the kingdom now, and I didn't need a bloodline to turn the lock. I sent a single encrypted message to Corson's private cell phone. It contained nothing but the coordinates to Pump Station 9 and a time midnight. I arrived at the station early. The wind was howling again, just like the night I died. The pump jacks were still there, their mechanical rhythm sounding like a funeral drum. I didn't hide. I stood right by the tank hatch, the same hatch where I had been shoved into the dark. I wasn't afraid. I felt a strange, terrifying peace. When Corson's headlights cut through the dark, I didn't move. He killed the engine and stepped out, a heavy wrench in his hand, his face a mask of desperation. He looked like a man who had lost everything and was looking for someone to blame. "Vig," he screamed over the wind. "You want to settle this? You want to talk about contracts? I'm done talking." He stormed toward me, the yellow light of the generator catching the sweat on his brow. He stopped 10 feet away, his chest heaving. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He saw the suit. He saw the way I stood perfectly still, perfectly composed. "Who are you?" he breathed, the wrench dropping an inch. "How do you know the things you know?" I took a step forward, the gravel crunching under my expensive shoes. I reached up and slowly removed my glasses, staring him directly in the eyes with a gaze that held the weight of 2 lifetimes. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence stretch between us, the sound of the wind filling the space where my brother's heart should have been. Corson's face went pale. His jaw dropped, a small, choked sound escaping his throat. He began to back away, his boots skidding on the oily dirt. He wasn't looking at a businessman anymore. He was looking at a ghost that refused to stay buried, and the terror in his eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I didn't lunge. I didn't scream. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter, the same one I had used to buy my way out of the shipyard in Detroit. I flicked it open, the tiny flame dancing in the gale, a fragile spark of light against the encroaching shadow. Corson stumbled, his heel catching on a rusted pipe, sending him sprawling backward toward the very hatch he had used as my coffin. He looked up at me, his hands clawing at the earth, his mouth hanging open in a silent plea for a mercy I no longer possessed. I stood over him, the shadow of the pump jack swinging across us like a giant scythe, my thumb hovering over the flame as the first heavy drops of a storm began to fall. The metal hatch under Corson's boots groaned, a hollow metallic shriek that seemed to echo the crumbling of his entire world. I stood perfectly still, the storm-driven rain lashing against my face, cooling the white-hot adrenaline that had sustained me since Detroit. The flame of my silver lighter flickered, a tiny golden heartbeat held between us, casting long dancing shadows of the man I used to be against the man I had become. Corson's eyes were wide, reflecting a terror so pure it transcended brotherhood. He wasn't looking at a sibling, he was looking at a predator that had crawled out of his own nightmares. "You're supposed to be sediment, Rune." He choked out the words, barely audible over the mechanical rhythm of the pumps. He tried to scramble backward, but his expensive shoes found no purchase on the oil-slicked gravel. He fell hard, his dignity dissolving into the mud as he stared up at me, trembling. "I watched you sink. I watched the air bubbles stop. How are you standing there?" I let the lighter snap shut, the sudden silence of the flame more jarring than a gunshot. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, feeling the crunch of the earth beneath me, the earth I was never supposed to walk on again. "The oil didn't want me, Corson, and neither did the grave. You thought you were burying a rival, but you were actually planting a seed. It took a while to grow through the filth, but I'm here now, and I've brought the harvest." I knelt beside him, not with the warmth of a brother, but with the cold precision of an undertaker. I grabbed a handful of his soaked lapel, pulling him close, until I could see the broken capillaries in his eyes. "Tell me, does it burn? Knowing that the junkie who took your ships, your trucks, and your credit lines is the same brother you tried to drown? I didn't even have to use a gun, Corson. I just used the numbers you were too arrogant to check." He tried to spit at me, but his mouth was too dry, his spirit already shattered. "Dad will kill you. He'll erase you for real this time. You're nothing but a glitch in his plan." I laughed, and the sound felt like ice breaking in my chest. "Abner. He's the one who taught me how to play this game, remember? He just forgot that the person you trained to be a shield eventually learns how to be a sword." I shoved him back toward the open hatch, watching him flail as he teetered on the edge of the dark, yawning abyss. I didn't push him in. That would have been too merciful. I wanted him to live with the memory of the edge, to feel the cold breath of the tank on his neck for the rest of his life. I stood up, leaving him sobbing in the dirt, and walked back to my car. The engine purred, a low, predatory hum that promised a different kind of ending. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the family lawyers. Instead, I drove straight to the heart of the Draken estate, the glass fortress that sat atop the hill like a crown made of thorns. I had the keys now, not the ones to the front door, but the ones to the vault where Abner kept the truth. The library was silent when I entered, the only sound the crackle of a dying fire in the hearth. Abner was there, swiveling his chair slowly to face me. He didn't look surprised. He looked at me with the same clinical curiosity a scientist might show a lab rat that had escaped its cage. I expected Corson to be back by now, he said, his voice as dry as old parchment. I suppose that means the logistics reports were accurate. You've gutted us from the inside, Rune. My name is Fen. I said the words, feeling heavy and solid in the air. I walked to his desk and tossed a thick folder onto the mahogany surface. It was the complete history of the birth swap, the DNA records I'd recovered from Alara Voss, and the financial trail of the hush money he'd paid for 3 decades. I'm the child of the gutter you used as a suit of armor. You played a high-stakes game of protect the heir, Abner. But you forgot one thing: if you give a stray dog a seat at the table, he'll eventually learn where you keep the steak knives. Abner looked at the folder, but he didn't open it. He simply sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. You were never meant to survive the night at Pump Station 9. You were a contingency that outlived its usefulness. Corson was the blood. You were the performance. A very convincing one, I'll admit. The performance is over, I countered, leaning over the desk until I was inches from his face. I didn't just buy your tankers, Abner. I bought your debt. Every offshore account, every hidden property, every royal asset you've been hoarding, they've all been liquidated into void capital. This house isn't yours. This chair isn't yours. Even the air you're breathing right now is being paid for by the trash you thought you threw away. For the first time in my life, I saw the mask of the great Magnar Draken slip. His eyes flickered with a momentary realization of total defeat. He wasn't losing a company. He was losing the very reality he had constructed. I stood up straight, feeling the weight of the last 26 years finally lift from my shoulders. I'm not going to kill you, Abner. That's what a Draken would do. I'm going to let you live in the world you created. I've arranged for a small room in a halfway house in Detroit. It's right across from the freight yard where I woke up. You'll have a front row seat to the life you tried to steal from me. I walked out of the library, the silence of the house no longer oppressive, but liberating. I stepped out onto the balcony as the first light of dawn began to bleed through the Texas sky, turning the gray clouds into a bruised purple. I pulled out my phone and looked at the camera, my reflection no longer a stranger's. The gaunt face of Fen Vig had merged with the cold stare of Rune Draken, creating something entirely new, a man who had died and been reborn with a purpose. I hit the record button on my video app. They told me that blood was everything, I said to the lens, my voice steady and raw. They told me that where you start determines where you end. They were wrong. I've lived in palaces and I've slept in sewers, and I can tell you that the only thing that matters is what you're willing to burn to find the truth. I looked out over the sprawling oil fields, the pump jacks, moving like slow prehistoric beasts in the distance. My name isn't important. My story isn't a tragedy. It's a roadmap. If you're trapped in someone else's plan, if you're the shield for someone else's sins, listen to me, the gate is open. All you have to do is stop being afraid of the dark. I ended the recording and watched the upload bar move toward 100%. I felt a strange, quiet hum in my veins, not the frantic itch of withdrawal, but the calm vibration of a life that finally belonged to me. I walked down the grand staircase for the last time, leaving the keys on the marble pedestal in the foyer. As I drove away from the estate, the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting long, golden fingers across the highway. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to see the empire burning behind me to know that I was finally moving forward. The road ahead was wide, empty, and entirely mine to write. I took a deep breath of the morning air, clean and free of the scent of oil, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I didn't just survive. I lived. If you've ever felt like a ghost in your own life, drop a comment below. I'm building something new now, something that doesn't care about bloodlines or legacies. I'm looking for the ones who were left for dead. Let's see what we can build from the ashes together. Stay tuned. This was just the prologue.